Chapter 32 Party Animals and Secrets of the Black Tower. We lived in the sprawling Woodland Hills house for more than 30 years, which spanned most of my career as a television producer, and our 3 girls grew up there. The house welcomed many Japanese exchange students, housekeepers, business acquaintances, and friends through the years, as well as its share of celebrities. We were never part of the Hollywood scene. After all, we lived in the Valley, not Beverly Hills, or Hollenby Hills, or Brentwood, or Bel Air. But we had our share of parties anyway, to celebrate holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, open houses, barbecues, pool parties, surprise events that Deborah and I planned for each other or one of our daughters. We had 2 weddings and receptions in the backyard for Susan and Melissa. Our actor, director, and writer friends came. So did studio and network executives, production people, and talent agents. I'm going to recall some of them now, not because they were rich and famous, but because at a certain place and time, they influenced and enriched our lives. John Rubenstein, Arthur Rubenstein's son, who played our piano until 6 in the morning. Mary Ann and John Saxon and David Hartman, alone or with a current girlfriend from the Bold Ones TV series. Producers Steve Bochco and Larry Cohen, and their wife. Steve's was the actress Barbara Bosson. Actors Herb Edelman and Louise Sorrell. Danny Dayton, who sang I've Got a Horse Right Here in Guys and Dolls. And his wife Arlene, a well-known talent manager. Producer Joe Swirling, whose father co-wrote Guys and Dolls. Angela and Alan Paul of the Manhattan Transfer. Jer Henshaw, whom I first met when he was an extra casting clerk, and who later became a Universal Talent VP and ran 20th Century Fox. He came with voluptuous starlets. Bill Braidman, who was a casting director and producer. He brought his wife Carlotta, who once challenged Bill to a race in our pool, fully clothed, and dived in alone when Bill said, 1, 2, 3, go. She spent years getting even with him. Paul Winchell and Mel Torme, Eva Marie Saint and her director husband Jeff Hayden, actor Robert Hogan and Sharon, E.G. Marshall with his beautiful young secretary, Dor Sherry's 2 daughters, author Jill and her sister Joy, with her writer husband Steve Kabak, composer-conductor Ian Fraser and his wife Judy. Ian has so many Emmys he uses them for doorsteps. Network development, Veep producer Bob Silberling and his wife Joyce. Director Brad is their son. Universal story editor Mike Ludmere and his Joyce. They separated for 10 years, then remarried. Actor, author, artist Peter Mark Richmond and his talented Helen. Comedian Shelley Berman and his warm and gentle Sarah. Hal Linden, who starred on Broadway in The Rothschilds and on TV as Barney Miller. Doug McClure from The Virginian. David Hasselhoff. Johnny Mathis, with whom my brother Roy worked for several years. Lonely, he came one Sunday to play with my kids and drink huge quantities of vodka with no outward sign. He was very sweet and kissed me goodbye when he left. Later we visited his Hollywood Hills home, spacious and filled with pillowed cubicles. Casting director and pal Joe Rich and his delightful Susan, young opera singers Gabriel and Deborah Riollo, producer Jay and Jackie Benson, writer-director Alex Singer and his wife Judy, producer Al Burton, and studio executives Frank Price and Sid Sheinberg. Jer Henshaw was a legend in his own lifetime, which was sadly not nearly long enough. He had a photographic memory for every detail of every movie, play, and TV show he ever saw, and he saw all of them. He could tell you the names and credits of every actor, no matter how small the role, an invaluable asset in his well-chosen career. He was also a genius with sports statistics. One of my fondest memories of Jer was spotting his bulky figure loping across the empty Universal lot on his way to the executive office building, the Black Tower, on the afternoon before Christmas. I yelled at him to see if anything was wrong, and he yelled back that he needed to catch his boss before he left so he could renegotiate his Christmas bonus. I thought that was amusing. I wasn't aware at the time that Universal customarily withheld a portion of what they considered to be your gross annual salary and gave it to you as a Christmas gift. Yer came out to our home one night with a flashy blonde model, and he seemed restless and impatient all during dinner. We had quite a bit of wine, and when she went to the bathroom, we could hear her throwing up. Yer confided that he was anxious to get her into the sack up at his aunt's lakeside mountain cabin. He planned to make a weekend of it, and his loins were suitably girded. He took some merciless ribbing until his date returned, a little worse for the wear and slightly wobbly, and he rushed her out to the car. Despite the hour and the snow in the high country, he was a determined man on a mission. We learned later that when they finally arrived at the cabin, Yer's date was still woefully hungover, and Yer had forgotten the key. If the ribbing was merciless before, it was intolerable after. On the cover of the following Sunday's Parade magazine was a lovely full-color picture of a sweet, innocent, blushing bride who looked vaguely familiar. Deborah was first to recognize her as Yer's Lady of the Lake. My mother and father loved our parties, especially my father, who was an incorrigible ham and who kept abreast of all the showbiz scuttlebutt, and Deborah's favorite cousin Rex, a young Marine stationed at El Toro, who used to show up with a bottle of Kahlua from the PX under his arm and happily tend bar all night. I was at Universal almost 12 years off and on, and for much of that time, Frank Price was my immediate boss. Unlike most executives, he had been a writer, producer, and executive producer before he became a Universal vice president. Later, he ran Columbia Pictures and had his own production company. I liked Frank. He was bright, thoughtful, and careful strategist. In one conversation, he mentioned the necessity of having a mentor to further one's career. And I suppose, for a while, he was one of mine. However, when he made me an executive producer of The Virginian, I was uncomfortable with the role, and probably not very efficient. Frank said little directly, but he could be brutal with subtle criticism. When he was seated and put his foot up on the chair, rested his hand on his knee, and flicked his cigarette lighter on and off, you knew the worst was coming. He had a well-nourished sense of humor as well, and could be very good company. In due course, Frank got into boats and motorcycles. Just before we went out to dinner one night, in business suit and black cocktail dress, Frank took Deborah for a spin on his Harley. He was in great form. On another occasion, I was in line at the supermarket on a Saturday when the man behind me said, "Hi, Joel." I glanced around and said, "Hi," but I had no idea who he was. His shirt tails were out. He was wearing sunglasses, shorts, and sandals, and at that moment, he was staring at me intently. Of course, it was Frank. At the time, I'd never seen him out of the office, and never without a suit and tie. I admit I'm not very good with names and faces. Deborah's terrific. She remembers everyone, and everything about them. I used to find that a little annoying, but now it's simply endearing. Deborah's distinctive personality includes a touch of ESP. On several occasions, the kids and I have witnessed her answering the phone before it rings and identifying the caller by name. That trait has kept us on our toes. She can also be quite direct and insightful. One evening in front of the Writers Guild Theater, we chatted idly with another couple while we waited for the show to start. In a momentary pause, Deborah said to the wife mischievously, "These two guys would introduce us, but they can't remember each other's names." She was right on. Sid Sheinberg was an influential Universal TV executive when we first became friendly. He's tall and lanky, slightly pockmarked. One night, during one of our parties, we heard my father's voice cutting through the tumult, telling Sid he looked just like Abe Lincoln, including the pockmarks. My father never admitted that it might have been a gaffe. He insisted to his dying day that he'd merely been complimenting Sid, but for a long time, whenever we talked on the phone, Dad asked me if I'd been fired yet. Most of our guests reciprocated at their homes, or sometimes at fashionable restaurants. Occasionally we'd run into each other at award events, screenings, or premieres. At Paul and Nina Winchell's house, one night we met comedian Sid Caesar, Harry Ritz, the surviving Ritz brother, who had us on the floor laughing, Larry Storch, who told a hilarious story about his hip surgery when he fell off the gurney and had to be operated on again, Dick Clark, and Rudy Valley. Stephen Bochco and I worked together at Universal before he created Hill Street Blues and NYPD Blue. For a while, we saw quite a bit of the Bochcos. In the entry hall of their home, we also saw quite a bit of their close friends. I assume they were close. Who had posed nude for an eye-catching gallery of full-length black and white photographs. They all had strategically placed camouflage, except one person, obviously flaunting his manhood, who posed with just a paper bag over his head. We attended a wonderful formal affair given to celebrate our dear friend Danny Dayton's 75th birthday at the Century Plaza Hotel, and the room was wall-to-wall celebrities. Many toasts were made, many jokes were told. Danny, with an oxygen tank close at hand, rose to the occasion. It was a festive evening, filled with warmth and camaraderie. Apparently, I had too much to drink, because I fearlessly and foolishly went up to the microphone with my anecdotes, following Jan Murray and Buddy Hackett. We were invited to Jerry and Patty Lewis's home in Bel Air one night. I was producing the Jerry Lewis Labor Day telethon for Jerry that year. His house once belonged to Louis B. Mayer, the second M in MGM, and it was pretty impressive. That night, the tented backyard was full of decorations and movie stars. But another night, when we had dinner alone with the Lewises and a couple of friends in their ornate dining room, we had a lot more fun. Once in an elevator in Vegas, Jerry took a watch from his wrist, yanked off my Timex, and replaced it with his. I was aware only that it was gold tone with a narrow black band, that I felt embarrassed, and I loved my Timex. Later, Deborah pointed out that Jerry's gift was a solid gold Cartier. The only time I saw Jerry one-upped was in a small, exclusive restaurant in Fort Lauderdale, La Palme, which was tucked behind a rear door in a larger nondescript eatery. We were having a pre-production telethon meeting with Josh White, a young New York director who was new to us. The owner, chef, cooked an open countertop range with a mirror above so his culinary skills were reflected. And the handful of guests interacted with him and the waiters throughout the meal. It was very nice, very informal, and for dessert, the chief made a big production of the soufflé he'd prepared in Jerry's honor. Ceremoniously, he produced the puffy treat from the oven and started towards our table with it. And then he tripped, and the soufflé went flying, and everyone gasped and grew silent, until we all realized that that soufflé was a carefully bunched white towel in a deep dish, which the chef quickly replaced with the delectable real thing. The loudest laughter was Jerry's. One weekend, Jerry invited several of us to Coronado, where his yacht was berthed. I remember David Hartman was there, and Jerry's longtime manager, who he came to love, Joe Stable, and his wife Claudia. We stayed at the wonderful old Coronado Hotel and hung out during the day on the boat. Jerry was extremely funny with his small, attentive audience, and we were hysterical most of the time, particularly cruising the harbor and attacking some of the large naval vessels docked there, with the sailors bunched at the rails, laughing with Jerry and yelling his name. I had no suitable yachting clothes, just Levi's and t-shirts, and Jerry teased me mercilessly about my attire. When I took off my tan windbreaker in the afternoon, it was my favorite despite a small yellow paint stain that I thought gave it character, and fell asleep on deck, I awoke to the gales of laughter as Jerry ceremoniously burned up the jacket with his high-flame cigarette lighter and threw the remains over the bow into the water. Later he replaced it with a jacket of his own. We visited the Coronado Hotel with the kids the last day the ferry ran into the island. When we headed home, the bridge had just opened. The hotel also served as a background for Ghost Story, Circle of Fear, my anthology series hosted by genial Sebastian Cabot. Mel Torme had a navigable houseboat for a while. We christened it Moby Boat, and we spent a great day with him and his then-wife, the English actress Jeanette Scott, cruising the L.A. harbor and shoreline, making indiscreet gestures at other boaters from the roof deck. We were friendly with the Tormes and surprised Mel at a couple of his singing engagements in Reno and Vegas. Occasionally, he ran classic movies for us from his extensive, not quite legal film collection at his comfortable home in Coldwater Canyon. We celebrated a great New Year's Eve at the Tormays after one of Mel's LA performances with his manager Dale Sheets, an old friend, and his actress wife Joan Staley, who worked for me when I first began producing at Warner Brothers. But it was author Harold Robbins who made the biggest impression on me. Well, even bigger may have been seeing Cary Grant stroll into the Universal commissary and watching all the heads turn, even the other stars and the top brasses. And on another occasion, interrupting a lone figure slouched in the back row of a projection room as I entered with my small entourage. I was distracted. I knew this was my scheduled time for dailies, and I tended to be impatient with the interlopers. The man was deep in thought. After a moment, he roused himself and stood up, unfolding, and I recognized one of my idols, Fred Astaire. The surprise left me speechless. I think I managed to mumble, "Hi," and he smiled and said, "It's all yours," and gracefully left the room. So the impression Harold made must have left the second or third biggest, but he was right up there. I thought afterwards of all the things I could have said to Fred Astaire. I could have told him in an embarrassing, classic cliché how much I'd enjoyed his films, or I could have described one colorful royal wedding production number in particular, featuring a missing chapeau. I left my hat in Haiti, in some forgotten flat in Haiti. I couldn't tell you how I got there, I only know it's hot there. So if you go to Haiti, there's a girl I know in Haiti. If you can find her, you'll adore her. Just look around, and you found someone who has a blue-gray fedora. I could have sung the song to Fred, at least some of it. Perhaps not such a cliché after all. Maybe he would have filled in the forgotten lyrics. Imagine, a duet with Fred Astaire, and I blew it. Harold Robbins had a development deal at Universal to write and produce an original primetime TV series called The Survivors, about the indiscretions of a wealthy, urbane family. It was long before Dynasty and Falcon Crest, and was way ahead of his time. So far ahead, in fact, that it never made it past the pilot. But one day, I had a call instructing me to get a camera crew together and show up at Harold's house the next morning to film him promoting the show. I'd never directed a film before, but I knew I had a mentor, because it wasn't the first time someone had offered tacit support. And I thought I knew who the mentor was. Jennings Lang, a tanned, handsome Hollywood legend, vice president of Universal Studios and head of Universal TV, my ultimate boss. There was a widespread rumor that when Jennings was a major talent agent at MCA, which was later disbanded due to a clear conflict of interest when it bought Universal Studio, he had bedded a well-known movie star. Her producer husband, enraged, presumably shot off one of Jennings' testicles in a restaurant parking lot. Personally, I doubted the story. Not the bedding part, but the shooting off part. I just couldn't visualize it, even for a trained marksman. Once when one of my many employment options was coming up, Jennings sent a memo to the business affairs office with a copy to my immediate boss, Roy Huggins of Maverick and The Fugitive fame. The memo said, "I'm sure Roy wants to pick up Joel Rogosin's option." Jennings sent me a blind copy. I had an office in the Black Tower on the Universal front lot and used the elevator several times a day. It was usually full of people laughing and chatting, but one day I found myself alone on the elevator with Jennings. Like all the Universal executives, at one time he was wearing a white shirt, conservative suit, and muted tie. Sometimes I thought that I detected a twinkle, but not this time. Jennings seemed thoughtful, preoccupied. I felt suddenly intimidated. I assumed a serious demeanor. After hellos, we rode up several floors in silence. And although Jennings' office was on a much higher floor than mine, he got up first, having lower floor business, I guess. And just before the elevator doors closed, he looked back over his shoulder, twinkled for a moment, and said, "Are you having any fun?" Then he was gone. It was an epiphany for me. I regret that I was too green or naive to fully understand or appreciate Jennings' sponsorship. I should have. After all, it was Universal MCA, with a widespread reputation for spotting a live one, and throwing him unceremoniously into the mix, with no parameters to see if he could survive. So long as you performed creatively and responsibly, as I did, you were allowed a good deal of autonomy and latitude. But I just took it for granted. When Universal's main lot was being extensively renovated, late 60s, I was asked to produce a documentary of the event without spending any money. With no budget, an editor, was it Bud Small, and I put together and had transferred to a film series of black and white still shots that had showed the entire process. We did some tiles and laid a soundtrack behind it, and it was a big hit with the Black Tower. I was also given the task of developing the main title for the new anthology, The Kraft Suspense Theater, a fairly delicate assignment, since not only were Universal and NBC involved, but also Perry Como's company, The Kraft People, and J. Walter Thompson, their ad agency. I worked with them closely later on the Jerry Lewis Labor Day telethons. Someone had brought a gifted artist and filmmaker, Ivan Durrell, to my attention. He showed me a computer-generated commercial long before computers and their uses were so prevalent. And I remember taking it to Lou Wasserman himself. The top Universal executives were, from their backgrounds at MCA, and by design, in the normal course, always accessible. I once had an occasion to call Jules Stein, the founder and chairman of MCA and Universal's chief executive, who had been an ophthalmologist and band booker in Chicago, when Deborah had a serious eye problem, and he was kind and helpful in referring specialists at his UCLA Eye Institute. Ivan Durrell conceived and produced a montage of stylized, animated, whirling figures and splashes of color for the Kraft Suspense Theater main title, which was unique and avant-garde. To their credit, Lou and the other execs, who viewed it hesitantly, approved. It must have made an impression. When I encountered Lou in a projection room later, he asked my opinion of the new Universal logos he was sampling. Earlier, I was complaining about projection room scheduling in a hallway one day when a soft voice behind me announced it was being taken care of. New rooms were in the planning stages. The voice was Lou's, and to my surprise, he called me by name. I suppose in retrospect that those events brought me to the brink of my relationship with Harold Robbins when I was asked to direct his presentation. Harold and his wife, Grace, lived in the classic Beverly Hills house just off Sunset Boulevard and around the corner from the Beverly Hills Hotel. Large, white, gated contemporary with beautiful grounds, a huge pool, and pool house. They were both cordial and gracious when I arrived with my skeleton film crew, and we spent the afternoon setting up and filming Harold in the pool area from a sketchy promo script prepared by the publicity department, rewritten by me and mostly improvised by Harold. I can only say that Harold, as smooth and sophisticated as his characters despite his tough New York background, was downright adorable during the filming. He lent himself to it with verve, and all went smoothly, except he wanted to change clothes between takes, which were to be intercut with footage from the pilot to represent continuous action. If we'd allowed it, Harold would have appeared to jump in and out of different wardrobes when the final edit was completed. Afterward, when the sun went down and we lost the light, Harold and Grace invited me inside while the crew wrapped up the camera equipment. In the family room was a wooden drugstore pocketbook rack that displayed all of Harold's novels. As Grace poured drinks, he removed one of each and sat at the bar, autographing them for me with separate messages. Although the survivors did not survive, Harold and I stayed in touch. Still, I was somewhat surprised when he invited Deborah and me to a New Year's Eve party. The Robinsons' year-end bashes were famous, and invitations much sought after. We arrived and turned our low-end Volvo over to the valet parking attendant, who buried it among the slew of Chryslers, Mercedes, Cadillacs, and Bentleys. Grace Robbins hovered near the front door, greeting newcomers and chatting animatedly. She kissed us both on the cheek as Deborah and I entered, and pointed us to one of the bars. The house and grounds were ablaze with light. Glamorous, beautifully dressed celebrities roamed and mingled, helping themselves to mountains of hors d'oeuvres and rivers of champagne. Immediately, we saw Judy Garland and Omar Sharif, whose gaze, I thought, lingered much too long on Deborah's trim figure. I wanted to confront him, but I restrained myself for Harold and Grace's sake. Outside the pool area was transformed for the occasion, with masses of colorful decorations, and everywhere there were famous show people and major sports figures. And there was music from 3 dance bands strategically placed. Some party. We might as well have given up on the party going after that. What could possibly top it? We were definitely impressed, but we weren't totally unprepared, because on earlier occasions we had been indoctrinated by, among others, Abby Gershler and Robert Douglas. Abby was a talent and writer's agent of the old school, slight, solemn-looking, pale hair and complexion, dark suits, and big dark chauffeured sedans, polite and soft-spoken. He was powerful because of his client list. He represented Martin and Lewis early in their career, and despite his deferential manner, tough as nails. Everyone knew it, and he knew they knew it, and he thrived on it. I was a smart-ass young producer when I first met him, and for some reason, I loved to tease him. Fearlessly, my usual opening was, "Abby, I'm glad to see you. I heard you had died." He certainly looked like it. West LA's Bel Air circuit was represented by entertainment people who lived in the area and who had their own projection rooms. On Friday nights, friends and colleagues would gather to screen the latest films as long before the release as possible for the sake of prestige. Abby was a member in good standing. One day, he phoned to invite me to a screening at his home. He was known to have a major collection of art and sculpture, and since Deborah had been an art major, I thought she'd enjoy going. My conversation with Abby went something like this. "Abby, I'll need directions." "Sure, where are you coming from?" "The Valley." Long pause. "The Valley?" "Yes." Long pause. "Okay, you take the 405 south to the Sunset Boulevard exit. Turn right on Sunset, right on Barrington. It's the second block. Got it?" "What's the address?" Long pause. "Joel, it's the whole second block." Bob Douglas was a well-known English actor who primarily played heavies in period costume pictures. When his acting career began to wane, he started directing episodic TV shows, and that's when I met him, when I was producing 77 Sunset Strip at Warner Brothers. Bob was witty, charming, still handsome, even with thinning hair. He was also extremely mischievous. Once when we were in pre-production, he called me to his office to meet a young blonde actress, introduced me, and handed me her portfolio. It was extensive, filled with provocative, totally nude pictures. He knew it would embarrass me, and it did. I couldn't wait to get out of there. At a dinner party at his home one night, the actor David Wayne and a couple of other guests decided to go swimming in their underwear. Nothing daunted, I stripped down too, and dived in, not having noticed that morning when I dressed that my daughters had tie-dyed my jockey shorts. They were shocking pink. At producer-director William Castle's house, we met film stars Janet Leigh and Marie Windsor. At Mel Torme's, Ricardo Montalban and Danny and Arlene Dayton, and talent maven Lillian Mizrahi. We met everybody. The night we went to Abby Gershler's, I thought I had the wrong date, because I mistook the gatehouse for his house, and the gatehouse was totally dark. I drove up the driveway to turn around, and there it was, in all its baronial splendor, a mansion that gave the term ostentatious a whole new meaning. Built on proceeds from the family fur trade and the entertainment industry. Inside was as advertised, and beyond the house, a commercial greenhouse where Abby, like Raymond Burr, Ironside, at his place in Hollywood, cultivated orchids. Abby must have arranged some kind of special zoning. He said the orchids paid the taxes. Incidentally, as promised, Abby Gershler's place occupied an entire city block. Harry Tattleman was a legend in his own time, a former MCA executive. At Universal, he occupied a unique production position. It was his job to turn series episodes into movies for theatrical or home video release. This required a certain skill, a certain ruthlessness, and cadre of local and inventive editors. For example, Harry took 2 episodes of The Virginian, one starring Lee Marvin and one, which I produced, starring Charles Bronson, married them to a half-assed storyline, and brought forth an abomination ultimately released as The Meanest Men in the West. The story involved two brothers who never appeared together in the same scene, and was otherwise notable for its unintelligibility and terrible reviews. I was horrified one day to find it had been included among my producing credits. A word here about the one-time Universal TV comedy exec Lester Les Colodny. He was dark and burly and extremely funny, with a proclivity for exaggerated laugh tracks if a new pilot wasn't working. One of his claims to fame was his insistence that he had once seen actor Joel McCrea's cock exposed in a movie. It might have been the Palm Beach Story, which would have been appropriate. It was a bone of contention with Les that nobody believed him. He spent months looking for a print of the film, while he roamed the Universal lot telling anyone who'd listen, "I've seen Joel McCrea's cock." Finally, he located a print, and all the skeptics crowded into a cutting room with him and huddled over a moviola, while Les went frame by frame through the scene in question, in which McCrea, wearing pajamas, walked across a hotel bedroom to answer a knock on the door. Impatience set in, and tempers flared as Les searched back and forth for the illuminating moment. Finally, triumphantly, he found it. A few frames of film which revealed the truth peeking out, and a bit more of Joel McCrea than he might have wished. Of course, Les deserves a word here.